area of the United States that you're in. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. It is a part of a 4-webinar series throughout this year. So I hope this is just the beginning of many that you will participate with us. These are the organizations that are delivering the content to today. We as instructors, as the presenters, will introduce ourselves when we get to those slides. A few more housekeeping kind of information so that we can get you through all of it.
Sure. This is Tom Vincent. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. With respect to CLE, because of the range of this webinar, we have not requested or approved or received approval for any CLE credit in advance. So if you would like CLE credit for this, you will need to self-report. Also, just standard disclaimer, this presentation constitutes legal education, not advice. There is not an attorney-client relationship created by this presentation. Please consult an attorney before taking any action that has legal consequences.
That message was for all the attorneys in the audience. Okay, we wanted to make sure that you are fully aware of the other 3 webinars that we are going to have covering these particular topics. This will be in the slides that you received, that you downloaded, so you can click on those links and be able to register for the other ones. The important things to make note of here, they're scheduled at they're scheduled a couple of months apart. So the next one is June, the one after that is August, and the last one is in October. The one in October is actually a live event, and it's going to be nationwide, and there's going to be in other states. More information, pay attention to the website, but it will be streamed live to other locations for people to physically be there. And we're also going to try to make sure that for those that can't attend in person, that we will try to be able to broadcast this to you individually, just like we are this webinar. So some information about those webinars. The next one that we're going to have is getting what you expect, establishing and managing expectations for your vendors. Vendors management is very critical nowadays. If you've never been requested by any of your clients or any of the vendors that supply services to you, you're probably going to start seeing a lot more requirements that you must meet specific standards in order to do business with other businesses. So we're going to be covering this in depth and in detail for all the service providers that are out there. So if you provide services to anybody, if you've got vendors that supply services to you, even if it's not IT, there are going to be critical things for you to know and understand. The next one is going to be safety in numbers, security issues for client information and the clients who provide it. So you have obligations. A lot of people don't understand that right now in every state, and the last state that's left, which is Alabama, is now creating their own Personal Identifiable Information Protection Act. There's a lot of things that every organization, every business, every individual that handles personal or private information for others, you're obligated by law to protect that. Although there's no specific standards, it does make it very clear that if you don't do it good enough, you're going to be held responsible and liable for that. So it's going to be a good webinar for you to attend and participate in and learn all of those laws that everybody must comply with. So regardless whether you've got a HIPAA or whether you take credit cards or any of the other information, you do have obligations to secure your data. And the last and final one, this is the one that we're doing on site. It's much longer than the webinars. We're going to be from 8 o'clock in the morning to about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We'll have lunch breaks and things like that. The title of that is going to be Order from Chaos, what to do during and after a breach. Those two things, you can say, well, I really want to know what to do during a breach. I don't really care afterwards. It's all over. But that's a vital part of the regulations and liabilities. If you don't do that follow-up after the breach, you open yourself up for many liabilities. But most important, good information to then follow up to say, what do we need to do to prevent this from happening again? So a much longer format, a lot more technical details. Basically, we'll be wrapping up everything that we've kind of taught in all 3 of these. we'll be wrapping them up with some very important information for how to handle those and how to communicate those, how to organize your incident response. We'll talk about some forensics techniques with that and all of those pieces. Right away for the first 3 webinar sessions, and that includes today, if you're a technical IT person and you're looking for some technical information about what to do to prepare for these breaches tools and things like that, these are more strategy type webinars, the information we have. We do have content for more technical to identify and understand the specific tools, the specific things, the system hardening specifically designed to prepare for and handle incidents, even to the forensics perspectives. There's new laws that says even if you're working IT and you're doing internal incident response for internal investigations, you still must adhere to some level of forensic standards, and there's some federal laws that's passed on that, and we can cover those. If you're interested in a more technical class than what this is, at the end of the webinar, there'll be a survey. During that survey, during the one of the sections to tell us any part of the information, your feedback on that, please make a note that you're interested in receiving a much more technical presentation to cybersecurity and specifically incident response type information, and we'll put together those webinars and make sure that we get that to you. All right, moving on. Meet your presenters, and we'll start with Debbie Anglin. Debbie?
Thank you, Calvin. Anglin Public Relations is here today because PR and communications is a vital function. So anytime an organization or company is experiencing a crisis of any type, communication becomes very important. We've been around since 1999, so we've seen a lot of crisis incidents, and we've seen things spiral out of control that didn't need to. So just being able to respond to those crises, following some good protocols and best practices is what I want to share a little bit today. But over that period of time of working with so many companies and organizations on crises, our firm has developed some more preventive techniques and a little bit of planning and direction to help potentially even avoid some of those crises to begin with.
Thank you, Debbie. All right, next presenter is Tom. Tom, take it, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Calvin. As I said earlier, my name is Tom Benson. I'm with Gable Gottwalls. We're about a 90-lawyer general services firm. We have offices in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and San Antonio. As for me, most of my background has been in regulatory compliance for different financial institutions, everything from banks, broker-dealers, and investment advisors in every area from consumer, commercial, broker-dealer, as well as wealth management, HIPAA, and a stint serving as a BSA anti-money laundering officer as well. My practice is really oriented towards assisting in the identification and prevention of issues stemming from policies, practices, processes, and understanding the framework that's established before a breach occurs, so that ideally, once everything is set up, as we'll talk about here today, then you've got a roadmap to follow rather than fumbling in the dark.
Thank you, Tom. And finally, the last presenter is myself, Calvin Weeks. I've been in the computer forensics cybersecurity industry for more than 25 years. I also worked in law enforcement. I've worked in the Department of Defense, securing classified systems and securing that. I worked on multiple investigations. I worked on the 9/11 investigations, the suicide bomber in Oklahoma. Most people don't remember that too much, but there was a suicide bomber that walked up to the OU football stadium and blew himself up when he accidentally blew himself up when he couldn't get inside the facility. Also worked the Murrah building bombing, as well as many other high-profile type investigations. I work primarily the electronic components of those investigations. Even back as far as the Murrah building bombing, there was a lot of electronic information that had to be gathered. I developed and taught cyber terrorism incident response and handling for the Department of Homeland Security, and I got multiple certifications. I won't go through most of them to bore most of you, but that was all I had room to put on there. So with that, we'll kind of move forward and kind of get started with our learning objectives for today. What are your obligations? When you're preparing for incident response, there are lots of different perspectives for your obligations in getting prepared, not just the technical ones, but the organization as itself, as a business. There's legal perspectives as well as preparing for those communications. In the middle of a crisis is not when you want to be trying to figure those pieces out. How do you get organized? We'll talk about that. What are the kind of components that you need to be concerned about when you're getting yourself organized for an incident response? And what to communicate to third parties. Even prior to an incident begins, you need to have those communications. And what are those communications with third parties? Whether it's your vendors or service providers, as well as maybe potentially some very large, very dear clients that you may need to communicate with. And how do you protect that process? We'll talk about that. It's now you've got to protect the processes. It's not just protecting your data. Protect this process. During incident response, we do this as well. We have to be very aware that some of these hackers may be monitoring or trying to disrupt the process for the incident response, because you got to remember their number one priority is keeping access, not just trying to sell the data. So very important for the hackers is to keep and maintain. So you got to protect the process that you have as well. We're going to do our first question right now. If you could participate with this, what function do you provide to your organizations? And please just select the right one that's appropriate for you.
And again, just a reminder for those of you that may have joined us late for today's webinar, these polling questions that are popping up on your screen right now, these are your ticket to CPE credit for today's session. So participate in these polling questions to get yourself qualified for a CPE certificate today.
Thank you, Tara. Okay, here's our results. Here's our particular audience. We've got some other in there, quite a few others, but that's okay. We've got some legal, we've got some IT security, we got our HR group and our executive board. We're going to try to cover all of these particular areas and discuss a little bit about each one of those as we kind of move forward. I'd like to turn it over right now to Tom Vincent to cover our next section.
Thank you, Calvin. As I mentioned before, and as we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, a lot of what each of us do in our respective areas is oriented towards making sure that clients know what it is that they need to do and have a way to do it. Well, for many clients, that starts with just understanding what information that they may have. When we talk about, we'll talk about in this section, looking at the type of information that you may obtain, hold on to, and in some cases, let go, where that information lives, how it flows, the different requirements that may attach to that information, and different ways that that information may be targeted based on the particular value that information has. And so with respect to data flow, the first thing I'll say is that I have found that back up here. There we go. That one way to think about data flow inside your company is much like understanding how the plumbing works in your house. Now, keep in mind that's not where it stops, but it's a good place to start. Think about how information comes in. How does it move through your company? Much like, I live in a house that's 100 years old. It's got sort of wonky plumbing, and it's important for me to understand how that works for my situation as opposed to someone that lives in a brand new house with brand new pipes. And similarly, with respect to data flow, it's important to understand what comes in, how does it come in, and where is it stored. And that can be everything from, for example, information coming in via email or hard copy. Does it come in from employees or clients or from vendors, or does it go out to any of those parties? Is it stored centrally? Is it stored locally on individuals' computers, or is it in the cloud? Then you'll want to figure out what sort of information you have. And this can be everything as you see here. These are three big categories, but really when we talk about information that we're interested in protecting, it's really any information that your company finds valuable, anything that you would not want aired publicly, posted, or provided to a competitor, let's say. The big categories you'll see here, for example, protected health information, that is certainly an issue for covered entities, but it's also an issue for certain entities that provide services to those covered entities. Business associates that may use protected health information as part of their dealings with those covered entities need to know how to protect that and what affirmative responsibilities they have. Similarly, with respect to non-public personal information, if you've got any financial information of your clients, but also if you have employees, you likely have their personal information as well. And if that information gets out, that can trigger breach responsibilities, just as if customer information got out. It's the last category I want to spend a little bit more time on when we talk about non-public commercial information. That can be anything from what we would call insider information. Let's say there's information about a pending deal that would be very valuable to people who want to trade on it before it becomes public. And that has happened recently. For example, in 2015, we saw action taken by the Securities and Exchange Commission against, I believe it was 32 defendants who were able to use non-public commercial information gained from a target to generate over $100 million in trading profits. But also, with respect to smaller companies who may not deal with that sort of thing, it may be more local. For example, how much are you paying your employees? Which is not something necessarily that you're going to use in a deal, but it is something that a competitor would be interested in to undercut your market advantage when it comes to that particular issue with your employees, as well as any product information that they may be able to get. Let's see here.
Tara, we lost our slides.
What do you mean you lost the slides?
There we go.
There we go.
Got it. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Next slide.
Click again.
Got it?
Oh, there you go. You went one too far.
Sorry, Paul.
There you go.
All right.
Okay. So with respect to the requirements that we're talking about, the different types of information that I mentioned all have different sorts of requirements and often require particular proactive measures to be taken. For example, we talked about HIPAA. Both covered entities and business associates have to have in place particular administrative, physical, and technical safeguards, which include things like a risk assessment of the dangers to that protected health information, policies and procedures addressing those risks, and identifying an individual responsible for maintaining those. And the lack of such measures is often the largest factor in the level of fines or penalties that are levied. For example, just recently we saw the first enforcement penalty taken or levied against a business associate. There was an issue with a lost smartphone that was unencrypted, contained information on about 400 patients, but because of the weaknesses in that business associate's processes, they were fined $650,000. Similarly, with respect to the reactive requirements or requirements that kick in after a breach, there are often specific requirements, and unfortunately, because they are at this point primarily state-based, there are many inconsistencies, such as the definition of personal information. Oklahoma's, for example, is first name or first initial plus last name plus social security number, driver's license number, or a financial account number or credit card number with a PIN. Other states include everything from medical information to, in one case, mother's maiden name. Similarly, the definition of breach varies. Some states, like Oklahoma, only include electronic information. For other states, if information is lost in paper form, that can be enough to trigger a breach notification as well. And similarly, from a timing standpoint, most states have some sort of substantive standard, but there are some states that impose a specific time frame, such as 30 days, or in one case, in one of our territories, as little as 10 days. And then lastly, you'll see there that these notifications requirements, are generally enforceable by state attorneys general. However, in some cases, individuals do have a private right of action. And depending on the number of records that are breached, there may be affirmative notification of the attorney general, as well as notification of a credit bureau. And unfortunately, with multi-state corporations these days, often you may have a situation where a breach notification isn't required by law, but it may be beneficial to a company to provide that notification to avoid those customers finding out from other individuals, given that notification is going to have to be provided. And there are a slew of trolling sites out there that highlight these breaches that have occurred, so that individuals who may not receive notification from the company may get it from one of these websites. All right, so when it comes to value, there are a number of things to consider. And it's important to understand this because employees and company officers are going to may act differently depending upon the value of the information and understanding why that's valuable. Medical records we talked about before, those can be used for billing fraud. Personal information can be used for identity theft, and non-public commercial information has been used for insider trading. And it's important to understand from a process standpoint what sorts of tactics are involved. Often there are brute force tactics, which Calvin can speak to, but more often than not with my clients, what I deal with are indirect tactics that may not necessarily require a hack, they just require the help of the employee. And that can include everything from phishing or spear phishing, where an email is targeted to a particular employee to request information that they shouldn't be sending out, to spoofing, where an email address is created that looks like a customer or vendor website and requests a change, for example, to bank account information for the vendor, so that the next time my client pays that vendor, they're actually paying a criminal.
Yeah, Tom, if I may, let me add in a little piece here about understanding the value. Whenever we do incident response for organizations and we talk about security stuff, I always hear the thing of, I don't know why I need to do anything because I have nothing of value. In the black market, in the world of the hackers, everything has value, whether it's information or the computers themselves. You hear, even parents say, I just have this old computer, it's got nothing of value on it. My kids play, games and things like that on it, has nothing of value. Well, hackers bank on getting computers like that because they know you don't care, and hacking that computer and getting access, it has a value. On the black market, a hacked computer goes for $25. You say, well, that's not a lot of money. But when you've hacked, 1,000 computers at $25 a piece, that's a pretty good profit. And it's usually not thousands. It's usually tens to hundreds, if not millions of computers that are hacked. And their goal is to keep and maintain access. So you think, well, if I ever get hacked, all they're going to do is steal data and then they're going to be gone. The majority of hacks, the number one thing they want to do is keep and maintain access to the computers. With our experience in doing incident response, we have actually set up some honeypots, some methods for managing and watching what hackers do on a sacrificial computer that we set up. And we actually saw two hackers fight each other to try to keep and maintain access, and they tried to block each other from getting in. It was quite amusing. Everything has value, but the most important thing, I think, for most organizations, when you start looking at value, whether it's the protected information, is to understand what has value to you as an organization. So the example I use to try to explain what we're talking about is if you take a soda company. The soda company, they bottle and manufacture their product, and they have to have a sterilized environment, and there are standards that they must meet. They must adhere to the health and standard codes. If they don't, then yeah, they could get sued, they could be fined. I mean, just it could be a disaster. They could be shut down, and that's important. And I promise you, all of the soda companies, they follow those standards. But if you were to ask the board and the executives, the people that run the soda company, what has the most value to them, they're going to tell you it's going to be their secret formula, right? Not that the health standards and all that's not important, because they're going to comply with that, but the value to the company, to the organization, is going to be their personal secrets to keep their business running. So understand value in securing your data. It goes a lot further than saying, well, what are the laws that I have to comply with? If you've got a business, you have something of value that's not covered by a law. It's just your personal interest in making sure that gets done. Whether we're talking about from the legal perspective, the technical perspective, or the information perspective. So it's not necessarily you want to do public relations, you want to do marketing, you want to get information out there. But clearly the wording of that, how that's worded, what you put out there, how you put it out there, all becomes very, very important to the hacker.
Right. All right. So I think it's time for our next question. All right. This is a question on standards, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail in the next section of our presentation. But to give us an idea of where everyone is with respect to the adoption of a standard. If you have selected one, please identify that one here, or if you have not, please identify that as well.
While we wait for those polling questions to come in, we did have a great question come in through the chat box. If my home computer has been hacked and in the process I removed all information off of it and reset it, wiped it clean to manufacturer settings, can the hacker still have access to that computer?
This is Calvin. I'll take that from a technical perspective. It depends. But the main thing is just understand it is potential that they could have. So if you're going to wipe that computer and rebuild it, don't use the same usernames. Don't use the same passwords on that. Be careful. I don't know how they may have hacked in. So your backups, you have to make sure you access those backups in a secure manner. Make sure that you scan those and make sure that they're clean before you restore them. When you build the new computer, make sure you build it off the network or in a secure manner where there's no inbound connectivity to that machine. There's no way a hacker can get access remotely, but yet you can still download and install all the patches and the updates that you need before you actually attach it to anything that has internet access. So it is potential, it is possible, but again, if you do it correctly, it's less of an issue.
And this is Tom. One thing I'd like to add to that is if your home system is hacked, something that I generally recommend people do is to go in and reset all of your passwords at work for those systems, in part because many people maintain password lists on their home computer for their offices, but also because depending on how your passwords are set up, I know in my experience, many people use personal elements in their work passwords, whether it's a kid's birthday or a pet's name. And so it's important to make sure that if any of that information was accessed by a hacker, that you scrub that out of any passwords that they could use to access not just your personal life, but your professional life as well.
Okay. Our responses here, it looked like over half of you have no standards that you recognize at all. And that's okay, but you know, again, as you kind of get started, you can attend as many of our webinars as you would like, but at some point you need to start looking at that. So we'll discuss throughout this presentation why those are important and as we get started. So let's move on. Let's get to the next section that I will be covering. Our next section is getting organized. This is probably the most technical part of our presentation that we'll do today. We'll cover some things that probably everybody's heard in just about any cybersecurity presentation or webinar, but we'll go into a little bit more details as far as a strategy and how to implement that and why you implement that to help you with your efforts to try to get prepared for the eventual breach. A lot of times when we ask people, whenever we do incident response, we ask them how many incidents in the past month have you had, and they look at us funny and they say, well, we've never had an incident. And then I just say, well, then you're not looking. You should be seeing things that need to be looked into, analyzed, at least on a daily basis. Some of you may not have dedicated IT to do that kind of stuff, but just understand, if you're talking about pure security, the more often that you can do that, and whatever a regular basis is, you need to pay attention to what's going on, because whenever you get hacked, don't look for your computer to stop working or you're just going to be able to see this. It could take you months to years to even know that you've been compromised. Don't find out after the fact. Find out as they're trying to get in, but you have to look at everything that you've got set up. That's what this presentation is about. So let's cover some of the technical strategy in this. So here's something that you should have seen quite a bit with many other presentations. Cybersecurity standards here. You got to have established patch management. You got to get those patched. You got to harden your systems, your environment, your network, your applications, all of your computers. You got to allow only authorized activity inbound and outbound. That's your firewall, right? You got to pay attention. What rules do you need? Well, only what's required. Deploy logging and malicious code detection everywhere, on the systems, on the network, on your applications, everywhere that you can. And establish regular training and awareness, right? That's pretty good, right? And if we're talking about to any general organization for awareness, those are kind of some of the things that you need to do. But let's talk about how do they work? How do you implement, how do you do this? So let's talk about those minimum standards, right? I'm picking NIST only for one reason. There's others to pick, but NIST, they just happen to be free. And if you can work around where they talk about sometimes that if it's a government system or it's a protected system, if you can just work around understanding it was primarily designed for maybe other organizations, if it's important to you, it applies the same. It just might say that it's a government or protected system. That just means it's your protected system that you're wanting to look at. I point out these four specifically because these talk about incident response standards. The particular pages that I point to here, that is primarily the actual technical process that you need to look at for actual incident response. The entire document is very good reading on all of them, but they all come from a different focus and a different perspective. So these are the resources that you would start with. Now, how many standards does NIST put out? They have over 100. They're getting close to near 200 at this point. And they cover everything that you could possibly think of, and there's additional resources that if you're looking for something very specific, that you can find it. All right, knowing your data. Identification of your information is probably more critical. It's either equal to or greater than the prevention in the first place. So looking at some of the requirements for you to protect that data and identifying what is it. If you say, well, I want everything protected, you can do that. And if you've got a larger organization where you have multiple physical locations throughout a state or throughout the United States, or maybe even throughout the world, that becomes a more complex issue. If you understand really the concept of what's trying to be done here, if you have some kind of protected data and you want to protect that, try to get control of the data that you want to protect, not necessarily your entire network. I worked for an organization that had a lot of public unprotected access, and they wanted it that way. But yet they also had data that was extremely protected, and it was protected by law. And it was just techniques that were used to separate and isolate that data out. so that the only thing that's really protected is the protected data. Everything is supposed to be publicly available and not really concerned too much about hacking, just from a due diligence to make sure that none of those computers become zombies or used to turn against hacking other people. So those were the kind of key important things. You want to look at, when you protect that, it goes down not only to what kind of firewalls or protection you put in place, but the processes that you put in place to say who can access it, when they can access it, what can they do with it? Can they just read it? Can they write it? Can they change it? Can they delete it? You need to look at all of those possible potential ways that that data can be accessed and manipulated. And then the one key primary thing is, can they take it off of the computer, the storage location where it's at, and take it off site, off premises? Those are going to be kind of key to understand and protect that data. Tom, do you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to just mention something really quickly, Calvin, because you raise a good point about how they're able to do that. And I just wanted to add, it's important to understand not just from the hypothetical of how could this be done with your systems, but it's important to understand how someone could do that just in their day-to-day processes. It's important, you know, there's a saying that all politics is local. Well, all prevention should be local also, because not only do employees need to know the general things that guide the company, we keep customer information confidential, but also how they do that in their regular day-to-day lives. That's why it's not only important to have these processes identified that reflect what your business practices are, as well as the requirements for the particular information that you handle, but also to make sure that employees are trained on that, both with specific applicable content and also at the right time, often before they get access to your systems, but also on an ongoing basis. For example, I recommend to my clients that they have a policy on bring your own device to govern personal devices that employees may bring to work and want to connect to the network or use to access company information. And also that they at least train on that policy in September or October so that they can get that fresh in their employees' minds before Black Friday comes and all sorts of devices go on sale that they can't wait to buy or receive as gifts and connect to the network, hopefully not in violation of that BYOD policy. But if they're aware of it, that can help them make the right choices and also make it easier for the company down the road in not having to deal with employees that are utilizing devices that they shouldn't be.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much. And that reminded me of some other issues. So whenever we get to this point when we're doing incident response, we always get the questions, and we ask the questions, the concerns, you know, what about personal cell phones and devices like that? Whether the company supplies it or they don't, you have this potential of those devices can be compromised as well. Data can be extracted and removed that belongs to the company, that's confidential, that's private, that is privileged on these personal devices. And how do you do that? How do you handle social media kind of stuff? Can they have a Facebook? Can they have a LinkedIn account? Well, yeah, in today's age in business, you almost want to do that, but how do you do that securely? How do you do that? What policies do you put in place? So that comes down to your policies and procedures. What about to the cloud? I have the biggest misperception about the cloud. Oh, let's move it to the cloud because the cloud is secure. That is such the biggest misperception. A lot of large organizations, cloud service providers, whether you're talking about Amazon, Google, any of the cloud service providers, any service providers that actually package their software together and host it in the cloud for you, every one of those, when you start asking as a vendor, you start asking them to provide the security information. If they're so secure, give me that data. Give me the proof that you're secure. I promise you, I've looked at enough of them. It is definitely going to say how well they secure the infrastructure to protect them. In fact, there is very explicit language in there, no matter what services they provide to you, that will still, they will carve out that piece, that any of the data that's yours, anything you do with your data in there as your responsibility to secure, they're not going to do anything to protect your data at all. It is your responsibility. They will take no liability for it as well. You cannot say, well, I have HIPAA, I have credit card information, I have protected information. I'm just going to put it in the cloud because that vendor, that service provider guarantees me that their system is secure. So therefore, I don't need to worry about that. You cannot do that. That is actually prohibited by law, by case law, and you could end up being held responsible even though it was in a secure facility, and hosted. Because you got to remember, separate the systems, the networks, the applications, and your data. Those are all separate components that have to be secured. So identifying what actually needs to be protected and how you prevent that becomes very important to identify and understand as you move forward. All right, so we're going to have another question. Our third question here is, where would you rate your organization is on awareness activities? Answer what you feel appropriately fits to your organization or company. And as a reminder, we will try to take questions during the presentation, but for sure, if we can't get to them during the presentation, please go ahead and type your questions out there. We will have time at the end of the presentation to address all of your questions that you might have. So if you've got a question, don't wait. Go ahead and type it in the section there. It says questions. Just type it in there and we'll get to it. If we don't get to it directly in our presentation or at the end, if there's so many, we will personally reach out to you and address those questions for you. And here are our results. Interesting, 37% says, I understand it is important and are beginning to discuss. So that's good that you're at that stage right now for your organization. Proceeding forward, I can just tell you that something is definitely better than nothing. There are organizations that can help with that. The main thing is, regardless of what you do, there are plenty of public resources that are available, but you must get it to where it is a regular activity, regular meaning possibly weekly, something ongoing, maybe have some kind of event around the awareness, things that are important to the company, right? So sometimes this might take somebody that's going to be dedicated and has the role and responsibility for those efforts. Most of your organizations may not have to comply, but just be aware, if you do get into a breach where it is a notification, requires a notification, you're going to want to have whatever your processes are, whether it's just your awareness activity or all of your cybersecurity activities. You'll also want to get that verified and audited, probably on a yearly basis, by a third party. All right, moving on. All right, response capability. You need to understand, as part of your cybersecurity efforts that you got going on, there are three components to cybersecurity. It's prevention, detection, and response. And it is a balanced approach to all of those. If you don't balance your approach to all of those, you're going to end up spending more money and not being successful. So the prevention, that's just everything that you can do, all the monies, all the budgets that you have to try to prevent an incident from occurring in the first place. The detection is all the monitoring, all the reading of the logs, looking for threats, looking for those risks to your organization, monitoring everything that you can to try to detect. First, you want to try to detect, is it beginning to happen? What you want to try to avoid is detecting that you've been breached, right? But you got to look for all of it, because you never know when that one hacker is good enough to bypass everything that you're doing for monitoring and start stealing stuff. But you want to definitely detect it at any point and as early as possible. The last thing you need to do is incident response. You've got to have a capability of response. So that means you've got to prepare, and that means attending presentations such as this, starting an effort to get prepared and planned for the incident. If you don't plan and prepare, then whenever an incident happens, it's going to be very costly and very expensive because you're trying to put it together as you're trying to investigate and figure out what happened. It could be very costly. So some of the things in looking at that response capability, you got to have some policies, right? Not only can have cybersecurity policies, but incident response policies. Whenever I conduct incident response, the policies, play a huge role in this, besides just all the laws and regulations that are out there. And sometimes it's not even a specific policy that says cybersecurity or incident response. It's all of the policies that you have in your organization if they're not built properly, and we have to abide by those policies. So it's all your HR policies, your, anything that you do to govern your organization. We have to abide by those. If those are not built properly, then it could limit the information that we could gather ourselves. It could limit the scope of what we do. It could require us to do specific things that would inhibit the successful incident response investigation. You want to have a cybersecurity incident plan. Plan for everything. Just like you do in trying to prevent, you also want to try to do all the planning to respond to that. Log and monitor everything. When I say everything, I mean everything. Of course, it's not everything that's going to be relevant. It's just by the time you figure out that you should have kept everything, it's too late, because you can't go back and create a log for something that was supposed to be collected at the time that it happened. So, drive space is going to be your friend. Learn how to manage that. And then when you start looking at logging and monitoring, who is going to read it? Who's going to look at that? How is it going to be reported? How is it going to be useful to you? But more importantly, how long are you going to keep it? That becomes important as well. You can say, well, we're obligated, we have to keep everything for 7 years. And for some organizations, that's true. Some of them have to keep it longer. There are some regulations that require organizations keep certain type of information forever. And the problem with that is, how much money do you have to spend on storage? Because logging and monitoring and taking on this effort, it can cost a lot of money for the actual storage of that. Reporting protocols for everyone. The communications, again, we cannot stress enough about how do you report this. Reporting internally to other departments within your own organization, reporting to the users, reporting to the board, reporting to everybody, reporting to other third parties, reporting to other colleagues, other people. I mean, all of that becomes very important to understand. You've got to have reporting protocols to control what information goes where. If you can automate that, that becomes even better. That way you control the information, you know that nobody's going to give anything out because it's already controlled. The notification and communication protocols, that's exactly what we're talking about. Well, you also have to do the notifications, and you got to do communications about what happened. It seems simple, well, you got to tell them everything. That's not true. And then depending on who you're talking to, you want to change that message up to make sure that it's delivering the right information to the right audience when it needs to be delivered. That's why we have crisis communications firms such as Debbie England's firm to help you with those kind of communications.
I think sometimes when we see companies that have not handled this aspect particularly well, it creates a secondary incident that they have to manage from a public relations perspective. So I think in terms of time and resources and doing it right would be to spend a little time and thought on roles and responsibilities in a response and who handles that crisis communication, making sure people are trained for that.
Thank you, Debbie. Defining the roles up front, on your incident response. Again, I see a lot of organizations who say, yeah, we got an IR team, and it's somebody in IT, right? It's various different people in IT. You cannot forget roles. A member of the incident response team must include somebody from the executive, HR. You got to have legal representation. You got to have cybersecurity representation. Yes, you got to have IT. The executive person cannot be somebody in charge of IT. You need that independence at the executive level. You got to balance that out, and there are very specific roles, and the NIST Standards has all those roles defined and when they're required. Some key and critical things when you're talking about some key roles. When you're talking about legal counsel, there's a lot of great attorneys that get hired by organizations to work internally. And that's great. You want to rely on them, they're great attorneys, but some instances, depending on what it is, especially if it's reportable, you probably want to look at having outside legal counsel. When you're doing the actual incident response, you probably have the greatest IT people in the entire world, but you still need that independence. You need somebody outside to work with internal IT to get that independence, somebody that could go testify if necessary. And on the cybersecurity and IT side, you need somebody independent to work with those IT, because the remediation is a different aspect. Cleaning this up and getting operations back up and running is a different component. And you need somebody third party to make sure that you're not creating more problems for yourself. Same with the executive on the cybersecurity side. Those are key and critical kind of things to understand. Tom?
One thing I wanted to mention, and then I think we will get into the prep work slides, is with respect to internal counsel, one of the things to be careful of is just because a lawyer says it doesn't mean that it's privileged. I have a number of clients who have general counsels who serve in more than one capacity, for example, as chief operating officer. And it's important to make sure that when someone is, acting as counsel in that discussion. Make sure it's clearly marked that it's privileged. Make sure that whoever it is that is acting as a lawyer is identified as such. For a good part of my career, I was a lawyer, but I was not acting as a lawyer for the company that I was working for. So my communications were not privileged, even though they were with another party and myself as a lawyer, just not the lawyer for the company. So it's important to keep that in mind to get that privilege as quickly as possible with the right parties.
Agreed. Okay, so wrapping this up so we can kind of move on, and I think after this slide we'll kind of maybe take some of the questions. The last thing I kind of want to point out on this capability is understand that there are laws now that are requiring you to meet certain standards on the forensics tools, the legal requirements, any of the contracts for third parties for incident response. There are specific requirements now that you must meet on that. So make sure you hire a qualified third party to help you through that process. Now, I'm not saying that it's not important for you to organize yourself and get prepared to do all of it internally. You want to do that. That helps keep your external cost low, but you got to meet those third party requirements. So before we move on to the next slides, let's take some of the questions. Tara, could you bring up the next one that we can address?
The next question?
Yes.
Like polling question?
Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So the next polling question, if you could answer that, what preparation have you done to respond to a breach?
We did also have
That's the one that best applies.
We did also have a couple of questions come in through the chat box.
Yes,
first question,
go ahead.
are smart appliances, TV, webcams, Ring thermostats at risk or put your network at risk?
Again, this is Calvin. I'll kind of start with this. The short answer, literally any device that you have connected to your network adds risk to your organization. Every network appliance that you have adds risk to your organization. Every computer you have plugged into your network adds risk. Any wireless device that you have connected to your wireless network adds a risk. Every application that you run in your organization adds risk. Every user that you add to your organization adds risk. They all have their own unique risks that you have to pay attention to. It's not just generically your network and your systems and your applications. It comes down to very specifically the very specific system, the code that's running on it, and how often that gets updated. And just keep in mind, everybody is familiar with this on the Microsoft side. Every single Microsoft operating system right now has vulnerabilities that are not going to be fixed ever. They're aware of them, they're just not going to fix them. Every single application that exists out there, every single operating system, the very specific versions, and every appliance that you have, whether it's a TV or microwave or a phone, a tablet, a computer, a TV game, you know, anything that you can connect to your network, either wirelessly or wired, brings additional risk to your organization.
Perfect. Do you think we have time to answer another question?
Yeah, we got time.
This one should be relatively easy. Do you remember having do you recommend having a separate section in the employee handbook regarding cybersecurity?
Tom, you want to take that?
I'll hedge my answer here by saying I think it's important to have a policy on cybersecurity to get people focused on it. But often what I find is that many other policies in an employee handbook and otherwise involve cybersecurity issues, but aren't very clear in that they do. For example, it's important for employees to understand how they can protect email, how to encrypt email if they need to, but then when it goes into specific job responsibilities, if there's an issue, I saw this with a client not too long ago, rather than raise the issue through their incident response plan process, which Debbie's going to talk about, it says raise it to your supervisor. And in some cases, there is an entire unprivileged communication that goes on between an employee and their supervisor over a breach that should have been funneled through the incident response process.
Yeah, another example that I have, I did some incident response for an organization. So the critical thing was about, you know, password sharing and things like that. That's what the incident was about. So I asked, do you have policies or do you have a password policy, a policy on passwords? And they did. The password policy, and it was just only a password policy. It was 4 pages long. It was the most beautiful document I ever read in my life. Very good stuff. I mean, you know, we'd all sat here and agree. But on the last page, there was a paragraph and there was a caveat that was put in place. You must adhere to every one of these policies that are, you know, every one of these sections that are written in this policy. And you know, if not, you can face penalties, blah, 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 all the good stuff, unless, and then it just killed the entire policy because they said, unless you get prior approval from your supervisor not to follow it. And then that basically killed the entire investigation as far as for passwords is concerned. Because basically, now we have to go and ask every single supervisor. They had no provisions in there to say, well, should it be documented? Who should approve it? Any of those kind of things. So since they had no formalized process to support the policy that they had created, essentially what it meant is anybody, as long as they asked their supervisor and they said it was okay, they could do anything they wanted to do with passwords. Regardless of the fact that they knew what best practices were, they just chose that they felt like it was very important. And it killed the entire investigation as far as for looking at the angle that somebody stole a password. With the way that the passwords were shared already, and they said that was a common thing that they did. The problem that created for that particular incident is that there was a misunderstanding by management or supervisors in that they thought that in order for them to give permissions to their employees to do certain tasks, that the only way they could do that themselves is to give them their own personal username and password. And therefore that just said, well, you regularly give out your username and password. We really can't help you with that. Become a huge problem with that investigation. So policies are good as long as you get the right legal counsel to review those and to make sure that they're properly vetted and input into the rest of the policies. You definitely don't want to separate them out to where you're trying to enforce those independently of all the other policies. All policies are just as important as all of the other policies. You don't want to separate them out and say, well, these are more important, so we're going to separate them out. They're all important. So you want to make sure you get a good attorney to vet the policies, how you have them written, how you have them placed and organized to run your business. Okay, we got our response back from the preparation done already to respond to a breach. We had a good 34% that have internal areas in the organization to assist with responding to a breach. And that's good. We generally find that somebody gets identified and somebody has some things in place to help do that. Generally, if you're going to put people responsible for it, you will generally already have a policy. It's good to see that there are some that have dedicated teams and the process is tested annually. Those are all good, but again, testing them annually, you want to make sure that if required, if it would help you, you might want to have those tested and validated by a third party, and get those certifications in writing so it shows the details of your compliance, what you're doing to follow best practices, and what standards that you adhere to, and that you have met those standards. An attorney or legal counsel can help you with that. If your incident response includes communications, make sure you get that vetted by appropriately an external communications PR firm that has experience with crisis communications. Because remember, when an incident happens, you need the answer right now, not in 6 months with a project. So keep that in mind. All right, let's move on. I think the next 2 slides, we kind of covered a lot with our incident response capability without proceeding on. So I think we'll move on to the next section to inform third parties, and I'll turn that over to Debbie.
Sure. Thanks, Calvin. We've talked about this a little bit. So I would venture to say that there's not an organization on our conference call today that does not work with third parties. So it's part of your planning and preparation process is to think through what you share with those third parties, why and when and how much. And Tom said something earlier about the ownership of the information is something about close to home. So understanding what data you share and that you still own the data. So in public relations, we work with, we're in the communication business, so we provide a lot of information. We get a lot of information. We provide a lot of information to third parties. So there's a lot of services, a lot of we in my office outsource our HR payroll. So having a conversation with those third parties in advance is the most important thing. And Tom can talk about contracting and reviewing what kind of contract they have. Better yet would probably be to have those third parties assign your cybersecurity policies and procedures, or at least understand those and agree to those. My point here, I guess one of my main points is to have a conversation. I think having a conversation with them about risks that you face, things that you worry about, can help shortcut, I think, what you need to include in those kinds of policies with your third parties. So I wish we would have thought of a question to put up there to say how many of you have had a conversation with your third parties about your risk and your potential response. You've got you may have part-time staff, you've got vendors, so just looking at who's responsible for what information and making sure that everyone is on the same page there. So when you have third parties who share information from a communication standpoint about a breach, and we've worked with a client where that happened, where their third party collected financial information on their behalf, that information was breached, and their third party went ahead and started talking to the public and the media about that before our client had the opportunity to catch them and coordinate the effort. So I think having a conversation about those kinds of things can cause it to be managed better, and really be able to delineate who's responsible for what, who's responsible for the response, and make it clear that you always own that data.
And one thing I'd like to add, Debbie, and then I'll turn it back over to you because I want to make sure we get through everything, and we're going to cover this topic in more detail at a later webinar. But you make a really good point, which is make sure with your vendors that you can control that message, because using a firm like Debbie's won't do you much good if you've got to compromise what you'd like to say with whatever your vendor wants you to say about the incident. I've got a client I'm working with right now where they've got a vendor that's built into the vendor agreement, where if there's any incident with respect to that vendor has to be involved in the messaging. And I realize that vendors want to do that, but from a process standpoint, it's often difficult to get that message out quickly and timely and effectively. And I do want to make sure, and Debbie, I'm not sure if this is the time to do it, but if you could just talk about briefly how important the speed is with respect to that messaging. It's very important to make sure that that is one of the drawbacks of having that sort of provision in a vendor agreement, is it takes more time and you lose the benefit of quick action and the mitigation effects of a speedy response.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. The windows of opportunity to make a statement and have an impact are much shorter than people imagine. So in crisis communication, and not just data breaches that where, people are hurt or people have, property's been damaged, those windows are very short. So we have a 45-minute window in communications. There's a 3-hour window and then a 6-hour window. And part of that has changed over time, certainly the last 10 years, because of the advent of social media. So we no longer wait for a news broadcast or a print publication to publish the next day. Those are still deadlines that are imminent, but we have more immediate deadlines. We have sometimes crises where people are there with a cell phone to record video and post it online immediately. So it kind of goes back to internal processes, but to start to think about your vendors, your third-party vendors, in terms of kind of your internal audience. Think of them as an extension of your own staff, your own organization, in terms of how they respond, what they do, how they share that information. So the windows are tight. They're tight and tighter, and tightest of all, it seems like every year we go, there's a new way to share information. So staying current on those and looking at those. And that's a great example with communications. Is we work with a lot of firms, a lot of organizations that have social media on autopilot, where you might type your tweet or your Facebook post well in advance because you're going to be observing an anniversary or something. There's some good news to share. You can schedule those, and there's lots of platforms that will allow you to schedule that in advance. Something negative happens, so if you've got an information breach, you want to halt those other communications because the tone is going to be off. So getting that message right is so important. That's why we're saying own that. So with third parties, when their information is breached, it's actually your information. So just being able to coordinate that and safeguard against a worse problem or a spiraling problem down the road. Oh, here's a cycle starting at the top to kind of look at your responsibilities and looking at how to solidify those into a contract with the vendors. And then that assessment is really important, where you're checking, monitoring, and continuing to improve that process to make sure all of your requirements, and your vendor's going to want all of their requirements to be met as well, but to go through some ongoing monitoring and looking at those processes. And then we're going to throw in insurance coverage, and my colleagues here might have a little bit more to add. There are a lot of things that can be covered by cybersecurity insurance policies, and businesses are typically unaware. If they do have a policy, they're unaware of what's covered. So some of your response and your mitigation efforts that cost a lot of money for legal services after the fact, public relations services, a lot of that can be covered in your cybersecurity policy. You just need to make sure that it's in there, make sure it's written well. That's something that sitting down and having a conversation with your insurance advisor, your broker, is a great idea. If you don't have a risk department in your organization, then typically that falls to the owner or the executive team to make sure that what you feel like you need is going to be covered with that.
Yeah, Debbie, my experience with the insurance coverage on cyber liability, they're all different. They all change year after year. And like me, none of my insurance, I buy it and it's covered and I don't worry about it. But cyber liability insurance right now is something that you have to keep on top of year after year because they change them on an ongoing basis. It's very volatile right now. And I think the key thing to understand is we keep saying, well, you got to involve these third parties, incident response without hiring any third parties can be extremely expensive. When you look at insurance, make sure that not only it covers the specific losses that you're at risk for, but yet it covers all of the third parties, including external legal counsel, the external incident response management, as well as the crisis communications management on that whole piece. All of that's critical, because not saying the right thing, not handling it correctly, not getting the correct legal advice could end up costing you a lot more money. So it's very critical. Tom, you got something to add to that?
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to mention, tying it back to the first section, and then I think we're about time for another polling question. It's important one of the other reasons it's important to understand how data flows in your company and what information you have is that is of crucial importance to your insurance broker as well when determining what the appropriate insurance is for you, but also so that they can understand what circumstances inform the underwriting of your policy. If you don't understand that you've got a lot of health insurance, health information, for example, and you purchase an insurance policy that doesn't reflect that, you may experience insufficient reimbursement for damages because that wasn't covered, or you could have a claim denied because you didn't provide them with enough information about your circumstances, or the right information about your circumstances for them to make that underwriting decision.
Thank you, Tom. All right, we've got another question to bring up. What communication resources does your organization have? What communication resources does your organization have? Select the right one that's appropriate for your organization.
All right, Calvin, and we did have some questions that came in through the chat. Can you give us an explanation of a hash library?
So yeah, that's a technical question and technical answer, believe it or not. A hash, that's an algorithm that if you apply a file, a set of data through the hash, the most common one is probably MD5 hash is what they call that. And it creates basically a 13-digit serialized number that's unique for each and every file, okay? And if the file is an exact duplicate, the MD5 hash will be exactly the same. If there's one bit difference, anything different about that at all, it will not have the same MD5 hash. It will be completely different. So even if you have a 10,000 page Word document and you go in there and you just add a space on one page, save it. Now for the reader, you didn't change anything. You may not even be able to see the space at all. So to the reader, they would be exactly the same. But scientifically, they are totally different documents, and the MD5 hash will not match. Now, what makes a hash library? Well, let's say you took that technique and you created hashes of every single file, including the system files, everything that you had on your computer. And you put that into just a library. It's just, you just put them all together and say, here is all of the hashes for my computer. And that would be a hash library. Now, what can you do with that hash library? Well, when you use that computer, as soon as you turn it on and you log in, it's changing some of the system files. If you wanted to know, well, what files changed, you get a tool that will compare the hash libraries, and it will identify the MD5 hashes that changed. Those are the files that changed. Now, if you had, it's like, well, that's a good idea. So what if you had an existing hash library for every known operating system, every known application? So for all the Microsoft operating systems, the Microsoft Offices, and what if you had the MD5 hash library for all of those that already existed? And then you did a comparison to your machine after you think it got infected, but your antivirus didn't detect anything. That's very common on zero-day attacks, where there's no signatures, there's no way to protect that, there's no DAT files to protect that, to detect it and clean it up or protect you from that. That hash library is how you then compare it to your existing machine to say, Microsoft has a hash, all of the good ones, and then you compared them to your existing ones, and whichever files didn't match, at least that's a lower subset. There's generally about 300,000 to 1 million files on any given operating system. That's a lot to go through. If you could eliminate as many as you could using the hash library of known good files, software, operating system files, and eliminate those, that's a fewer subset of files that you get to look through to say, what may have happened here? Did I get infected by something? So that's the value of hash libraries. You can get them from one of two sources. You can get them directly from the organizations themselves, like Microsoft. Actually, NIST is the ones that is the organization actually publishes the MD5 hash libraries for every organization. And it's also a good idea to learn how to create your own hash libraries to have your specific proprietary files, the way you configure your systems, and that becomes proprietary to you, that nobody would have those configurations. So if you created your own hash libraries, you could quickly analyze those MD5 hashes and determine what files have changed on your systems. It makes forensics analysis a lot quicker and a lot faster if you have that information. Oh, that answers that. All right, we're going to get our results here of our fifth question here. All right, over 50% has no dedicated communication resources or full-time profession. That is not unusual, as you can see that. That's kind of what we expected. It's good to see that you have dedicated communications internally, but with little crisis management. That's okay, even if you have in-house communications with crisis management, you still want to use a contracted third party for crisis management and communications. That helps alleviate some of the things that you could get attacked with as to why did you do that. You have a third party, and of course, a part of that team would also be other third parties, such as your legal counsel and incident response professionals that are helping you handle and manage your incident. So a lot of those communications will have a lot of vetting, but crisis communications is not the same as standard communications or marketing or anything else. It's different, and you got to make sure that you handle that appropriately. And sometimes the reason why you don't do this internally is because there could be an unidentified or unrealized expectation or restrictions that come into play when an internal person may not want to go against an executive who's making decisions. So that's why you look at those third parties to help justify this is why this decision was made. It helps you, with the legal arguments to defend, an insurance claim you're making. It defends whatever regulations that you might be looking at, fines that you might be looking at, or lawsuits that potentially might come up.
And a question actually I wanted to ask Debbie, we've talked about this before, but I think it would be really helpful here, is just, you might talk for just a little bit about, often that first answer of yes or no, we've been breached, and with the understanding that there's some sort of affirmative notification that's required. You might talk about the difficulties that companies face in making that decision, and some things that can help them get to the point of, yes, we have to tell our customers that something's happened.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think a lot of times what companies fear is loss of reputation, damage to reputation and trust from their customers, and that's both perceived and real. So I think that's definitely a risk that you're facing, and it becomes not a public relations problem, then it becomes a business problem, how you're going to communicate with them. So there's a variety of ways to use it. Depends on what kind of information it is. Obviously, I think having conversations in advance between your communications professional and your legal professional who will represent you in these kinds of situations is really important. So we have worked with many attorneys over the years and have found varying degrees of understanding about what the long-term effects of are from too little communication or communication that's too late. So there's an immediate problem. There could be some cases. I think experienced communications folks understand that and can work within those parameters so that we don't do anything to jeopardize a current or future legal standing. And I think that's why the conversation in advance is very important. But there's so many ways to communicate with folks these days, with customers, with regulators, with other vendors, shareholders, whoever those audiences are, is to have some identification and decide in advance what the most effective ways to communicate with them would be. Whether that's, I get letters all the time at my house from a bank or a credit card or something like that that's been breached. There's also other ways to communicate with people, and when it becomes a very large problem, you're going to start having some media inquiries on that. And I think having the training to be able to respond to that with a high degree of transparency. I think the worst thing that you can do is a media interview that looks like you're withholding some information, or certainly if you come out with a statement and more information is released the next day or a week later, we have a drag effect where the issue keeps coming back up and back up. So you're in multiple news cycles over multiple days. That's the best thing to avoid, right? Would be to come out with a lot of clarity and a lot of transparency early on. And I think we're in a day and time where the reasonable expectation is that sometimes we can do everything we can to prevent that, and criminals have more and more creative ways to get that information. So I think it's happened enough to most people that they have an understanding that sometimes that happens, but the way that you communicate and the way that you handle that, remediate, make it okay for those customers, provide them some potential future monitoring services for free. There have been some great examples of that, where potentially there's some long-term liability for your customers. So being able to communicate that quickly is really difficult if you haven't had those conversations in advance and looked at some very likely scenarios and kind of worked through those with your leadership team sitting around the table and talking about decisions. So.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of our session, and we're getting close to being able to take more questions. So since we're getting close, if you haven't already asked a question, you have one to ask, be sure to type it in, and we will get it addressed. We're on our last slide. We'll cover this very quickly so we can address any last-minute questions that we might have and any last-minute issues. The last slide is protection. It's protect your process through regular review and maintenance. Update and revise as your business processes change. That's the one thing you got to understand is there is no bullet point. There's no one size fits all. Every organization is unique, and any growing business, changing business, it is always in constant change. And you always have to consider cybersecurity as a part of your everyday process, just like you would anything else. You want to maintain privilege throughout your key processes. You want to consider retaining counsel before a breach as well as after one. There's different concerns. There's different issues to go along with that. Consider retaining an IR management firm and crisis management firm to consult with before a breach as well as after one. There are different concerns before a breach versus after the breach, which we will cover in great detail during our last webinar that we do. So please pay attention to that and go register for the rest of them. Tom, you got any last thing, or Debbie, before we move on to taking questions?
Just one thing I wanted to say on the privilege part. It's important with respect to the granularity with which these breaches are looked at. I mean, just look at Equifax, for example, where the Chief Information Security Officer's college major was scrutinized. That it's important to get privilege in place as quickly as possible, both to avoid that sort of scrutiny, but also because it's very important as quickly as these things can happen to make sure that you get as much candor and as much honesty as possible. And if you're worried about someone discovering that in a lawsuit and using that against your company, that can work against that need. So one of the things to consider, for example, is set up an email with your team and include counsel on that email. And whenever there is an incident that someone has a question about, have them use that email address. Call it issues@company.com or something to that effect. I've seen them all variations, but the common thread is it's an easy to remember email that people use to ask for legal advice on a particular information security incident. It starts the discussion in a privileged environment. If it's nothing, then it goes nowhere. But if it is something, then you've got everyone who has a seat at the table on the thread at the same time. So the legal, the cybersecurity, information security, and crisis communications members of your team all hear about it at the same time and can work on it simultaneously without stepping on each other's toes or duplicating efforts. And again, cutting into that speed that Debbie talked about is so important.
Agreed. Communication, communication, communication is key for getting prepared and preventing an incident. So communicate. All right. Questions. Tara, did we get another question in?
You bet we did.